It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Okay, you're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'm your host this morning. We're in our third segment, and we're going to touch on the issues surrounding Fort Hood and the debacle of how this thing was so mismanaged, so baselessly and flippantly ignored by the FBI and the military itself, that you got to question the ability of this administration to do anything right when they bungle everything that they touch. You know, there's an old adage out there about the Midas touch, right? Everything that Midas touches turns to gold. This administration has completely the opposite effect. Everything that this administration touches turns into this slag heap of smoldering and smoking ruin. They've done it to Obamacare. They tried with, they've done it in so many areas. They're doing it with our education system. They're doing it with our social system. They're doing it with race relations in the United States of America. Everything this administration touches turns to a molten heap of slag. It's just, I'm stunned that Americans don't actually see the damage being wrought on our nation. This administration moves through history like have you ever been to a small canal where you've got docks on both sides and a boat that goes up the middle of the canal creates a wake that ripples out on either side? And, there's no wake signs all over the place because they don't want these big waves to be bashing their own boats against their docks and smashing their docks and such, right? This administration reminds me of a battleship in a narrow canal at full steam. The havoc and the damage that they leave in their wake is unimaginable. I'm appalled and I'm blown away by the amount of, and then they cover up. They routinely cover up their mistakes. And in this case, this was relating to the Fort Hood issue. A year before the massacre, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, intercepted emails between Nidal Hassan and the radical cleric whose name was Anwar al-Awlaki. Now, they called it fairly benign. That's the quote that they used to describe the emails that were going back and forth between these two guys. Now, Awlaki was a Muslim cleric who was an English speaker, and he was one of the top dogs in Al-Qaeda at the time. He's now dead. He got nailed out by a drone strike. And the information that transpired and went back and forth between Hassan and Awlaki is so damning that a first-year analyst could have looked at that information and said, we got to throw a flag on this play. You don't have to be a seasoned umpire to recognize the obvious. Now, what's even more damaging is that Robert Mueller, who's the FBI director, or he's outgoing now, he claims that the FBI intercepted these messages, but when asked if the Bureau had dropped the ball, here's his response. No, I think given the context of the discussions and the situation that the agents and the analysts were looking at, they took appropriate steps. Well, let's explore that for a moment, because they didn't take appropriate steps. The discussions and the situation were so blatant, so obvious, that anyone with any intelligence whatsoever would have reacted in a manner that would have said, I've got to look further into this. And I'm telling you right now that this is a PC issue. This is a political correctness issue and that's why the cover-up. And unfortunately, Americans are dead, and many, many other Americans are permanently wounded for life because political correctness led the charge, took the day, held the high ground in this case. And ladies and gentlemen, that's a crime. That's a crime against the United States of America. And it's a crime of treason against the individuals who are suffering today as a result of this scumbag's treatment and the lack of these are the watchdogs that chant constantly, we're here to protect you, and we have to steal your rights and your liberties and your freedoms away in order to do it. But then when they get the opportunity to actually do it, what happens? Nothing. Fairly benign is what they called these. Lieberman, a senator, Joe Jowls, he made an effort to make these things public as part of a 2-year congressional investigation. And they barred that, and they barred it from being used in his trial, saying that presenting these emails would be unfair prejudice and undue delay. Now, wait a second. Explain to me why, again, then, the NSA wants to capture the emails for every living American person. Explain to me again why the NSA needs to capture the telephone calls, the metadata, the content of those phone calls for every American citizen. If it's unfair prejudice to use it, and you refuse to accept the information that those phone calls tell you, then what's the point of having them? The FBI quietly released the emails in an unclassified report on the shooting. And they did it last year. But they don't make any noise about this. They just silently leak this thing out there. And then they can say, because that gives them plausible deniability to say, see, we weren't covering anything up. But, that's the equivalent of printing the election results for a presidential election to the United States in a little classified 2-line ad in the back of page 39 of the New York Times. This thing is so fraught with corruption, CYA, scams, lies, cover-up, political correctness. I mean, really, it's 173 pages. I'll give you a link to it on our Facebook page and on our website. You can find this there's a report there on motherjones.com. I'm not a big fan of Mother Jones News, but in this case, this thing is right on. And because I am a critical thinker and I am actually fair and balanced, unlike faux news, I'm actually going to find when I find an organization or a group that I disagree with who actually presents the truth, I'm going to show it to you and I'm going to tell you about it. Because I'm not a Kool-Aid drinking ideologue. I'm a truth teller, and that's the difference. The FBI released these emails in an unclassified report on the shooting, page 39 of the New York Times, notifying us that who won the presidential election. And they are far from being benign. They offer us a pretty frightening glimpse into what actually transpired and what some of these emails said. Because he was actually asking Al-Awlaki about and for information on whether or not there were like reasons for him to become a martyr, what was justified as collateral damage. I mean, some of this stuff was so obvious, you know, you'd have to be Pinocchio to miss it. Alaki was killed in 2011 on a drone strike. And at the time, he was really a very serious player in Al-Qaeda. And he was transmitting these emails back and forth, and there were a lot of them. Not one or two now. We're talking about a significant level of these things that first appeared back as far back as 2008, a year before the actual shooting by Hassan at Fort Hood. And he emailed Alaki and asked him whether serving in the U.S. military was compatible with the Muslim faith. He also asked Alaki to answer if he considered those who died attacking fellow soldiers martyrs. Hello, red flag. Now, here's the rub on this thing. First of all, the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force intercepted Hassan's December email, along with another one sent in January. They turned him up as a comm officer at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. COM, C-O-M-M. First of all, they made the mistake to think that meant he was a communications officer. And so they considered it to be something that was not worthy of their looking further because he was a comm officer. What they neglected to understand, and in military jargon, I don't know how, because the military lives under acronyms, it didn't mean comm officer as in communications officer. It meant commissioned officer, which meant that he was in a position of authority over other men. So they failed to issue an intelligence information report, which is the standard for when they find something like this. And this is the type of thing that came about as a result of post 9/11, when they said we're gonna tear down the brick walls between all these agencies, the NSA, the FBI, the DHS, the ICE and Immigration and Border Patrol, and so these guys can all openly communicate back and forth, and we'll never have this compartmentalized failure again. Oh, really? So the San Diego agents misinterpreted comm officer to mean communications officer when it actually meant commissioned officer, and believed that the person in this role might have access to these intelligence information reports, because if he was a communications officer, he might be able to see these reports. So they didn't create one. Big mistake. So to avoid tipping them off, they skipped the report and sent a detailed memo requesting an investigation directly to DC's Joint Terrorism Task Force. And the message noted that Hassan's, quote, contact with Alaki would be of concern if the writer is actually the individual identified above. Nobody did anything with the file for 2 full months. Then it was assigned to an agent for the Defense Criminal Investigative Services who was on the task force. It came out in a 2011 report that the DCIS, a law enforcement agency within the Pentagon, which normally deals with fraud and cybercrime inside of military personnel and contractors issues, was poorly equipped to tackle a counterterrorism investigation. So they handed the file off to a guy who wasn't qualified to do anything with it. Didn't have the tools, didn't have the experience, didn't have the knowledge, the inside track, didn't know anything about it. Hassan kept writing to Alaki. Between January and May of 2009, he sent the radical cleric more than a dozen emails and got back 2 relatively benign responses. In one message, ostensibly about Palestinians firing unguided rockets into Israel, Hassan asked Alaki whether, quote, indiscriminately killing civilians was acceptable. 2 days later, he sent another message answering his own question. Here's what he said. Hamas and the Muslims hate to hurt the innocent, but they have no choice if they're going to have a chance to survive, flourish, and deter the Zionist enemy. The recompense for an evil is an evil. Now, this is Hassan's direct email response, right? Or not his response, but he's answering his own question here. Well, first of all, if that doesn't raise enough flags that this guy is in a position of command authority whether he's a communications officer or a commissioned officer or a commanding officer, makes absolutely no difference. When you see an email like that and you don't take action, you are malfeasant in your duty. That is, there's no difference between that and falling asleep on guard duty in a war zone. The San Diego office intercepted also these same emails. But the databases where the FBI stored the intercepted email didn't automatically link messages from the same sender. So the staff didn't realize that Hassan's 2009 emails were from the same person. Now, wait a second. I use something called Microsoft Exchange in Outlook. And it's a commercial program that can actually tell me how many times I've gotten an email from this person or that person. Are you going to try and tell me, with the trillions of dollars we've spent building systems and surveillance and developing all of these tied massive databases and dossiers, that these guys don't have the wherewithal to accomplish the most basic of fundamental tasks? I mean, really, the absurdity of that is just mind-blowing. Meanwhile, the Washington DCIS agent assigned to investigate Hassan put off his inquiry for another 90 days, the maximum window allowed under the Joint Task Force rules. And then he conducted a cursory investigation. In the course of 4 hours, he ran Hassan's name through a few databases to see if the psychiatrist was targeted in previous counterterrorism probes. He also reviewed his Pentagon file. His officer evaluations were mostly positive, and he was the chair of psychiatry at Walter Reed had written that Hassan's research on Islamic beliefs regarding military service had, quote, extraordinary potential to inform national policy and military strategy. Yeah, they sure did all right. We learned all we needed to know from Hassan just a few scant months later, huh? I mean, talk about misreading the tea leaves. Talk about not being, please. This is the equivalent of guys seeing an elephant track in the woods and turning around and saying, yeah, it's a big rabbit. The Senate investigation found that these reports bore no resemblance to the real Hassan, a barely competent psychiatrist whose radicalization toward violent Islamist extremism alarmed his colleagues and his superiors. Quote, unquote. What? And nobody's acting. Everybody's just passing this guy around. They're bungling it. They have no clue. They don't have any idea how to track back multiple emails that this guy said. I mean, look, you want to talk about failure to accomplish your mission. Shee whiz. So they concluded that he had contacted Awlaki in connection with academic research and was not involved in terrorist activity, quote unquote. Are you kidding me? Advocates for the Fort Hood victims, who are now suing the federal government, have made a quote. A U.S. Army major is writing to this imam and essentially asking for religious sanction to kill American soldiers. And the FBI's Washington field office doesn't even interview the man or make a phone call to his superiors. It's utterly incomprehensible. I think that pretty much sums it up, don't you, folks? In May, to make matters worse, Hassan's emails to Awlaki take an even more ominous note. In one message, he says he heard that a speaker defending suicide bombings is permissible, and he laid out the following rationale. This is Awlaki. This is Hassan's own email now. For example, he reported a recent incident where an American soldier jumped on a grenade that was thrown at a group of soldiers. In doing so, he saved 7 soldiers but killed himself. So, this is still the email now. I'm quoting. So, he says this proves that suicide is permissible in this example because he is a hero. He's referring to the guy who was talking about the speaker, right? Or the speaker who was talking about defending suicide, but defending it for a completely different reason than killing innocents. Then he compares this to a soldier who sneaks into an enemy camp during dinner and detonates a suicide vest to prevent an attack that is known to be planned the following day. It's typographical error. Hassan made the case that the second act was as heroic as the first. And then he delves into the question of collateral damage, where a decision is made to allow the killing of innocents for a valuable target, quote unquote. Here's what he writes. I would assume that suicide bomber whose aim is to kill enemy soldiers or their helpers, but also kill innocents in the process, is acceptable. And nobody's raising flags. In fact, they went so far as to label his case not a product of interest, quote unquote. I'm telling you, this whole thing, and we're going to run out of time because I don't have the time to go through this whole article, but I encourage you to read it. Their excuse now, and of course it's always in hindsight, was that that all of this communication was regarded at that time as Hassan seeking to simply research Islam. That's the official quote that they use. And I got to tell you, that is so inexcusable. It's so far outside the concept of what these people. Listen, if we've spent $1 trillion building this massive spying and surveillance infrastructure that allegedly is only supposed to catch international traffic, but really is sucking up vast amounts, vacuuming the American communications strata. But when they finally actually get some proof that they can use, and they bungle it this bad, I say toss the entire project out the window and start from scratch. In this case, the baby needs to go out with the bathwater. One of the SD agents, immediately after the shooting, said, quote, "You know who that is? That's our boy." Surprised. I got to tell you, the level of incompetence, malfeasance, and complete and utter disregard for the principles of what these people are really supposed to be doing is mind-blowing. And if this is what we can expect for the freedoms and the liberties which we have to give up on their demand, then I got to tell you, I ain't willing. And you shouldn't be either. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Find us on the web at americasvoicenow.org. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/America's Voice Now. I've posted this Mother Jones report or link to it up on Facebook. Make sure and on our website, go get it. Take a look at it. Read it yourself. And if you're not furious by the end of the time you've finished reading this, I don't know what's wrong with you. When we come back, we're going to talk about the nudge process and the nudge program of none other than Cass Sunstein, the social engineer. Man, I'm telling you, boy, it's stacking up deep and it's coming on fast. Wake up, America. You're listening to America's Voice now. We'll be right back.